What's going on, guys? Thanks for stopping by my channel. In today's video, we're going to be talking about whitespace and the importance of using it within your designs. Whitespace is one of the most crucial elements of designs, and it's so important to get right because it helps your design not only be more aesthetically pleasing, but readable and functional so that people can easily navigate through your web page or article or whatever you're designing. So sometimes people will refer to whitespace also as negative space, and basically the two words are kind of used interchangeably. What white space is kind of, the space that's white on a screen or the space that isn't filled with design element. The best way that I've heard white space described is using an analogy and comparing it to music. So a song wouldn't be a song without the space between notes. It would just be like a jumbled mess of sounds. There would be no rhythm, there would be, no real interest in a song if it was just, straight sound the whole time. And the same idea kind of applies to design. There would be no rhythm, there would be no song without white space in a design. Your design would basically just be a jumbled mess of different design elements that isn't really usable, isn't really readable, and is far from aesthetically pleasing. So like I mentioned before, white space doesn't necessarily have to be white. Basically what it is just negative space in design, so anything that isn't covered in design elements. So there's two major categories of white space. The first being macro or active, and the second being micro or passive. So active or macro whitespace is what most of us think of when we think of whitespace. It's the columns, the margins, the spacing between paragraphs, any spot where there's a big chunk of whitespace. Well, passive is actually like the space between letters, the kerning, the small space between different icons. That would be considered as passive or micro whitespace. Well, it's important to consider both in developing a successful, readable, and aesthetically pleasing design. Probably what you should focus more of your efforts on is the active whitespace and how that's going to affect your design. When you use whitespace correctly, it helps move an eye through the design very easily. It helps users find information much more quickly, and it makes the design in general more aesthetically pleasing. When whitespace isn't used properly, designs can look extremely cluttered and almost anxiety-inducing with the amount of elements that can be jammed into a screen. Super confusing, super hard to read, super hard to navigate sites without proper use of whitespace, and really just kind of a terrible experience if whitespace isn't used properly. A really great example of whitespace being used properly is the Google search engine. So when you pull up the homepage of Google, there's two big columns on both the left and the right, and your eye is immediately drawn to the center of the screen where the main function is located, the search bar, as well as the logo of Google. The screen is extremely simplistic, yet extremely effective and aesthetically pleasing because of the proper use of whitespace. You're not left looking around at a bunch of different images on the screen. It's really just purely about function. Whitespace can be extremely intimidating at first, especially for somebody who kind of had like a more traditional art background. A lot of times in traditional art classes, we're kind of taught to make use of the entire canvas. But when making something like a design or a web product or designing an article, it's important to actually not fill the page and give users room to breathe, I guess, when looking at your design, and room to easily find different parts of the website. So it can be intimidating at first and almost make you feel like you're being a little bit lazy, leaving a big white section of the screen unfilled with any design elements, but it gets a lot easier and you'll be able to implement it more easily and more successfully. Cluttered design is kind of like a cluttered desk. If your workspace is kind of a mess and you got pens all over the place, papers all over the place, it's really hard to find what you're looking for, and it's hard to focus on a single task when your desk is just covered in junk. It's very similar to the idea of designing a web page or an article or whatever. It's very hard to navigate through a really cluttered website in the same way that it is to work on a cluttered desk. Additionally, improper use of whitespace can lead to really slow page load times because the page obviously has to load a lot more intricate design element. And a website that properly uses whitespace is probably going to load significantly more efficiently. So using proper whitespace in a design is really, really one of the most critical things you can take into consideration when building a website or whatever you might be designing. There's actually a really funny story about the Google homepage, as it was kind of like one of the first companies to start implementing whitespace, or I guess a large portion of whitespace, into their designs. Or into their user interfaces. So with initial user testing, people would actually sit and stare at the Google homepage and wait for all of the rest of the screen to load because there was so much white space. And they ended up resolving that issue by putting a little copyright thing at the bottom of the page that kind of like let users know that the full screen had loaded. But it's kind of like an interesting story, although it's not totally relevant anymore, because people have faster internet. They kind of know that the page is loaded, and obviously they're more familiar with Google now and probably more familiar with Whitespace. Back then when Google had first launched, there wasn't a ton of like really nice user experience or user interface design that properly used Whitespace. So I guess users hadn't really totally grasped that concept. Properly using Whitespace can also help with user comprehension of the information that you're trying to convey, because it helps separate information into unique categories. So that idea of grouping and using Whitespace to kind of create groups of elements, design elements within whatever you're building, is actually part of Gestalt psychology. And specifically, the law of proximity is the idea that when users see elements grouped together on a page, they naturally assume that those design elements on the screen have kind of like a related function. So going back to the Google homepage, you can kind of see how they have all of your recent sites as icon lists under the search bar. So it's easy to see what you were recently looking at, and naturally, since they're so closely grouped together and also grouped together with the search bar, it kind of like gives you the idea that maybe these are web pages that are associated in some way. So Google utilizes that Gestalt principle and the use of Whitespace to create that grouping of design elements, which kind of helps with user comprehension. Additionally, Whitespace can oftentimes imply a sense of like luxury or sophistication within a design. So for example, you can see Apple using a ton of Whitespace on a lot of their new product pages. It kind of carries the idea of simplicity and, I guess general minimalism, which is kind of like a trend these days, and definitely implies that feeling of like luxury and sophistication. I don't know exactly what it is about it, but it definitely just makes you feel like the product is simple, well thought out, and only conveys the information that's really necessary and really pertinent to the design. So to wrap things up, Whitespace is one of the most critical elements of design and oftentimes one of the most overlooked. Proper use of Whitespace can create a visually harmonious design, something that is super readable, super usable, can improve usability of a website or article, and just general function. It's really important to think of Whitespace not just as like a blank, empty space of the screen, but as a really intentional design element in itself. Whitespace is one of the most critical elements of design, and it's really important to take it into consideration when making your products. So that pretty much wraps it up for this video, guys. Thanks for watching if you made it to this point. If you are interested in more content like this, it would be awesome if you'd subscribe to the channel. And leave a like below if you thought this video was interesting. It really helps out the channel and boosts me in the YouTube algorithm. And if you have any questions or just want to chat about Whitespace, feel free to start a conversation in the comments below, and I'll definitely get back to you. Pretty responsive on here. Usually I can reply within the first few hours. So yeah, thanks again for watching, guys, and I'll catch you in the next one. Later.